So, lots of tabs, that means one thing, lots of stories. So, in this segment, we're going to be talking about this joker here, Dominic Sandbrook, writing, "I once feared Brexit would tear people apart, but after the pandemic, it may be what saves our divided nation." Seriously, bro. Honestly, no, it's not. It's going to make it worse. And this article is absolutely horrendous. It's really bad. So, for those of us who relish national stereotypes, the first days of 2022 have brought us the old sense of dislocation. As the bells rang in the new year last weekend, the streets of Edinburgh were deserted. Hundreds of miles to the south, Newcastle, Manchester and Liverpool were packed with Scottish partygoers escaping the hog-many restrictions imposed by Nicola Sturgeon. So he's talking about a divide amongst the nations because Scotland had lockdowns and Nicola Sturgeon urging people not to go out essentially. And mix with people, and in England it's a free-for-all. So you had people from Scotland coming down south to England, which people are like, oh, it's their lives, let them do what they want and blah blah blah. But I'm just like, yeah, they're just going to go back and spread infections. Not great for an overwhelmed health service, but people are making their own decisions now thanks to a feckless government. But with Wales First Minister Mark Drakeford having banned crowds from sporting events, the Welsh Rugby Union is considering moving the team's home games to London, sending tens of thousands east across the Severn Bridge. So essentially, here's another example of restrictions in Wales, and what happens is those rugby, the rugby union saying, okay, look, we need to make ticket revenue, so we're just going to host the games in England then, where we can have packed stadiums. It sounds absurd, and in the long run, I suspect data will show Boris Johnson was right to defy the pessimists and keep England open. Well, given the way cases are, it's pretty bad in all three, in Scotland, Wales and England. But I think it's worse in those countries. However, big caveat of England did run out of tests, so there were periods where we haven't been getting tested to the point where Wales actually had to donate 3 million tests. I think we've got that here. Wales loans England 4 million COVID tests. So that's why there might be a lull in the numbers. We'll have to wait and see. But once the death statistics come out, then we'll see what happens. When the Prime Minister unveiled his Stay Alert slogan, Miss Sturgeon could barely restrain her scorn. Then she produced her own Stay Safe, saying like, oh, Boris Johnson came out with the slogan first. That made Nicola Sturgeon really angry because she's trying to differentiate herself, do her own thing. Which is, I don't think for the most part, really true, is it? Scotland doesn't have a ton of things they can do kind of independently, but the stuff they do have, like taxation, they don't do it a ton differently. Tax rates are slightly different in Scotland, but not much. When he introduced a 3-tier regional restriction system, she shook her head in horror. Then she produced her own, not 3 tiers, but 5 tiers, which I think is excessive and confusing, but arguably that would keep people safer than the 3-tier system, which wasn't the best anyways. All very obvious and unfortunately very effective, and where Sturgeon led, Drakeford followed, consistently imposing more draconian restrictions on Welsh businesses than those across the border in England. I mean, Mark Drakeford, a guy who's doing his best to help the people of Wales, hence why he was voted in, or the Labour Party were voted in again, I believe, in Welsh elections. Only yesterday he attacked Boris Johnson, accusing him of not taking action to protect the people of England, which is true. He didn't. We haven't been prepared in England to the point where we had to loan tests from Wales. That's how bad the situation is in England. A statement that flies in the face of the data really doesn't, given how bad the hospitalisations numbers are in England. Or in the UK, should I say. That restrictions have to be imposed because the numbers are that bad. Other countries have restrictions imposed. We're one of the few that don't. And look at our bad numbers. COVID is exposed, people, I mean to say this actually, people just kind of converge to deaths, but it's not just about deaths, it's about how full the hospitals are. Can they do routine and emergency operations? Can they do things like cancer treatments? These are the other important metrics. You have to look at how bad the situation is with ambulances. Just because someone doesn't die of COVID, they've gone to the hospital, they've taken up resources. Don't mean that in a mean way, but in terms of we don't have a ton of resources to spare in the NHS. So that causes a problem. People's routine operations can't get done. That causes further backlog. If you've got a pain in your shoulder that requires an operation, if you cannot get that shoulder corrected in the long run, in a year or two's time, it's going to get far worse, and you may require more complex surgeries, which will cause you further long-term problems. Honestly, these people are like, oh, it's all about deaths. It's not. It really isn't. COVID exposed all the weaknesses in Britain's devolved political model. No, all it does is expose how bad the Tories are compared to the other devolved governments. As being a gift to separatists. That is kind of the point. It was a compromise to say, look, you guys want to run it? Cool, go on then, let's see what you can do. Handing them the opportunity to find themselves as supposedly against the supposedly wicked Tories. That right there, this line here is a massive cell phone, because that's exactly what they've done with their policies. They have defined themselves against the English, and when England said we can't do certain things, Wales and Scotland were like, nah bro, you always could have done, you chose not to, honestly. See, within England it has acted as a kind of solvent, weakening the bonds between different classes and regions. Not really. It's only weakened it to the point where politicians have allowed it to get weakened through their crappy policies. Just think how much Greater Manchester Mayor Andy Burnham paraded his outrage for the cameras when soaring infection rates forced his city into a regional lockdown. And this is annoying because Andy Burnham, right? The people of Manchester and North England were offered only 67% of furlough compared to the 80% that we were getting across the nation. And then what happened was eventually there was a national lockdown and the 80% furlough came back. So this argument this dude's making here, saying like, oh, Andy Burnham got mad for the camera because he wanted to look really cool. Like, no, bruv, he was fighting for his city. He was fighting for the northeast of England because they were shortchanged by a government who only wanted to offer them 67% in furlough payments when they offered the nation 80% in furlough payments. You guys wonder why I get annoyed. It was pure pantomime. No, it wasn't. But Mr. Burnham got to see his name in lights, fighting for the common folk against the Westminster tyrants. Again, a massive cell phone there again. That's exactly what he was doing. Which brings me to his party leader, Sir Keir Starmer, who delivered a much-trailed speech on Tuesday about Labour's rediscovery of British patriotism, much of it the usual wood and waffle, but my attention waned. He talks about Scottish independence here, so just a few decades ago you would have been mad to doubt the enduring power of the Union Jack when Britain's task force returned triumphant from the Falklands. I mean, you faced the country in Argentina, which, you know, let's be real here, is not doing too great. Wasn't doing too great at the time. Crowds of the Quaysides waved those flags just as they did after England's World Cup in 1966. I mean, was Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland really celebrating England's World Cup win that much? I don't know, Chief. But he talks about, does the Union Jack have that same symbol today? Does it still unite the nations? No, is the answer. But we'll go on to see this madman's musings. Last year, a YouGov poll found that 1 in 5 people actively disapprove of flying the Union Jack. Perhaps they equate it with the supposed ills of the Empire. What do you mean, supposed ills? Empire was bad. Empire was bad for the vast majority of people who were in the Empire. Another poll in 2020 found that 33% of Midlanders saw themselves as more English than British. Only 18% said they felt more British than English. I mean, that's kind of the right. It took me a while to figure out what he meant by that, but I'm assuming he's talking about the rise of English nationalism, which kind of in itself is a devolving factor in the Union. You know, if you believe yourself English rather than British, it kind of weakens the whole point of the Union. For an answer, I turned to a chilling essay in the American magazine The Atlantic by British political journalist Tom McTeague, or Teague, don't know how to pronounce his name. I think he wrote a joke article in The Atlantic that we covered a while ago about Northern Ireland, which was really bad. The grim reality of Britain as it faces 2022, begins McTeague, is that no other major power in England stands quite as close to its own dissolution. True. You know, he talks about how other countries have, you know, collapsed of Czechoslovakia, Czechoslovakia. I've used so many countries there, but yeah, they've gone. But you know, it didn't necessarily have to be this way for the UK. It's the main problem the UK faces is the Tory government. Travelling the country, he is struck by the sense of the nation coming apart. In Scotland, the only signs of the British state were the partially privatised post office, which again shouldn't have been privatised, and that could have been a sign for national pride. The post office, the pound, the monarchy. Is this really enough? No, but again, like if you did more things that brought the nations together, it'd be a lot better. You just didn't. In one revealing anecdote, he gets his second... I mean, this is a bit ludicrous, but I think I know why this has happened. He gets his second COVID vaccine whilst he's in Scotland, only to be plunged into bureaucratic black hole for 5 months. He tries to get the Scottish NHS to provide proof of his second jab, but he can't get onto his website because he doesn't live in Scotland. That's a problem, and that's because the Scottish have their own kind of system for the NHS, rather than the English one. I believe that's what's caused this problem. They won't even post the evidence to him because he lives out an English address. I mean, it's a bit stupid, but bureaucracy is what some people love. In Britain, he says something has died, a sense of collective story and united family, which is true because we've treated the other bits of the union like rubbish. Really, anything outside the southeast of England and London has been treated fairly badly. Even the north of England has been treated really badly. So this idea that the united family is coming apart because of the lack of collectivism is very true. But you've had this, Tory governments have pushed the individual rather than the collective, and that's a huge problem here. For those 18th century Britons, the pillar of our national identity were obvious. The monarchy, the Royal Navy, great for imperialism, Protestantism, religion, and a hugely profitable empire abroad, ransacking other countries, robbery, theft. Today, the Royal Navy is a shadow of its former self. I mean, in the modern world, you don't need a strong navy. You need a strong air force and potentially a strong army, but you don't need a strong navy, not in this day and age. Few of us go to church, which, again, religion is dying, and the empire has long since disappeared, which is great. Only the monarchy remains, and even then that's straining, because once the Queen dies, which is probably going to happen in the next decade, let's be real here, who's going to take the throne? Charles? Does anyone like Prince Charles? And then you've got William. Does anyone like him? No. So, yeah, that's going to be a huge problem. And, the union is dying. It's true, but it's been dying, I think, mostly down to the Conservative government and consistent austerity and that kind of, what has the country done for me? That kind of ideology is coming to rear its head. As the devolved administration's COVID posturing shows, again, they're doing what they think is best for their nations. In Northern Ireland, a majority of voters now think there should be a referendum on Irish unification in the next decade. Why is that? That's because the Westminster government, in its infinite wisdom, decided to separate Northern Ireland out from the rest of the Union in order to get their Brexit deal through. That's what happened. So this was the country itself forcing its own separation from its union, which, arguably Northern Ireland shouldn't be part of the UK. It really isn't in a lot of ways. In Scotland, the most recent poll found that 55% would now vote to secede. I think the issue here is that, campaigning hasn't really started and we don't know how the Scottish government run itself. But to add to that, or to counter that, Nicola Sturgeon, I think, has done a pretty okay job in Scotland. She had limited resources. She's kind of messed up in certain areas, but she is limited in some of the things she can do because they can just use England to bypass any restrictions. And even hitherto quintessent Wales, there is a renewed national self-assertion with support for pro-independence at 42%, according to one poll. And let's be real here, this guy, he talks about how, we need, these guys, not him specifically, because he hasn't said it in this article, but they're like, we need freedom from Brussels and make our own rules and laws. And then once Scotland and Wales are done, it's like, you can't do that, you don't know what you're doing, man. You need to be part of us, man. You need us. So it's just a load of rubbish. Why is it that, we need Britain to be independent from the, so-called bureaucracy of the EU, which doesn't actually exist? The fact is we were more powerful as a member of the EU than Scotland and Wales are as members of the UK. At least as members of the EU, we had a veto, for a lot of things, I think. And the UK doesn't have that. Scotland and Wales can't veto the Australia deal or the New Zealand deal. They have to suck it up and deal with it. And Northern Ireland, they have to suck it up and deal with it. While we're members of the EU, if the EU wanted to do a deal with Australia, which would, trouble England in any way, shape or form, we could say, nah, bro, we ain't doing that. That's a veto. So again, just nonsensical points. At some point, almost certainly in 2024, there will be a general election. If it's close, the SNP will fancy themselves as anti-Tory kingmakers, as they should. If Mr Starmer is within touching distance of Downing Street, the price of that support will probably be a second independence referendum. It will not be. It might be a supply and confidence agreement where the SNP will lend votes on things they agree with. It doesn't necessarily have to result in a second referendum, but that will probably be their asking price. So no matter how keenly he wraps himself in the Union Jack, he could go down in history as the man who brought down the curtains on Great Britain. Maybe, but if it's not him, it's going to be Boris Johnson or one of the next Tory stooges. But let's be optimistic. I'd rather not do that. That's for... The end of the pandemic, or at least the worst of it, is surely not far away. Although many serious economic issues remain, Britain should soon be back to work, which, okay, great. A buoyant, booming Britain is a very different proposition from a divided lockdown one. I mean, again, other countries have gone back to pre-pandemic levels. We haven't. We're the outlier. But the trump card for the union may be Brexit, the thing that I once feared might tear it apart. I mean, no. I mean, Brexit is the thing tearing it apart because Scotland wants to remain a member of the EU. That's a problem because the UK aren't going to go down that route. It's going to have to be through bits and pieces. If Scotland voted to leave tomorrow, it'd find itself both outside the EU and the United Kingdom with no viable currency. I mean, that's not really true, is it? Because they're going to have time to leave. There will be a transition period where they will have a currency, colossal debts, and a hard border from Solway first to the North Sea. I mean, that's not true either because it will be up to Scotland how to police that border. And it'll be up to England how to police that border. We're not going to put a hard border in Scotland. We don't have the border officers, right, to do checks on goods coming from Ireland to the UK. In fact, I don't think we even have enough to do for ones from the other parts of the EU to England. So the idea that we're going to impose a hard border is ridiculous. Scotland aren't going to do it either, not until they become members of the EU. There's no reason to. So again, this man making nonsensical points once again. Once more, all successful nations need something to define themselves against, as the past year, the EU Leviathan. I mean, that hasn't united the nations. If anything, it's divided it because the other countries, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland are incredibly reliant on the EU for trade. Wales trades more meat with the EU than it does with the UK. That's with the rest of the UK. That's crazy. That's absolutely insane. With frequent riots and protests in Paris and Amsterdam. I mean, okay. So he talks about temporary problems, right? As the years pass, these are temporary. The protests and riots in Paris, they're going to stay because that's how the French are. And to be fair, or some of the French are, and I respect them for that tremendously. In Amsterdam, those are temporary. They'll all go when COVID goes. Authoritarian regimes in Budapest and Warsaw, they're probably here to stay for a while, potentially. But they're not going to leave the EU anyways, and there's no mechanism for the EU to actually kick them out. Rows about borders and migrants and scandals about corruption and waste. I mean, again, these are specifically English problems because the rows about the border, that's here to stay, asylum seekers, because we're out of the Dublin 3 agreement. So what does that mean? That means is we can't actually send people back who come here through via France or any other EU nation. So that's here to stay. The scandal about corruption and waste, that will be there as long as Boris Johnson's in charge and potentially the other Tories. It depends who takes charge after him. May well become an answer. I don't know what that means. Maybe temporary thing. There is, after all, an unanswerable case for Britain, the nation that ushered humanity. I mean, we were the nation that came up with concentration camps, so ushered in humanity, really? Honestly. Pioneered science and medicine. I mean, not really. I mean, it comes in, global changes. We were putting leeches on people when the Arabs were coming up with medicines that actually cured people. So, no. You could argue to an extent England pioneered science and medicine, but all nations have at some point in their life cycle. China was, a massive kind of. I think in the Bronze Age, China were great at bending metals and things like that. So again, it's just ludicrous. Stamped out slavery, helped exacerbate slavery, and is involved in modern slavery. If you look at places like Leicester, where people get paid £3.50 an hour, and stood firm against continental tyrants such as Napoleon, Hitler, and Stalin. Okay, great, and who cares? Cool story. For us, millions of us, the Union Jack is more than a historical relic. It's a symbol of the precious bond that united people of our islands in friendship and fellowship. Yet we don't treat these people as friends. You've been very, very unkind to Nicola Sturgeon and Mark Drakeford in this article. Do you treat them as friends? Maybe ideologically you're different, but you've been most unkind to those two leaders of sovereign states. And let's be real here, this is a joke of an article. Absolute rubbish thinking that Brexit will unite the nations. It's going to cause it way more problems, especially as these countries face more and more problems getting in raw materials and goods via the Dover-Calais crossing. But yeah, I'm going to leave it there. Let me know what you think in the comments below. What an absolute joke this man is. And yeah, support the channel on Patreon if you can, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one.